sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Officer Daniel Carter sat in his patrol car at the corner of Maple Street, sipping from a lukewarm cup of coffee as he scanned the area. It was one of those rare evenings where everything seemed calm. No noise complaints, no speeding vehicles, just the occasional hum of an air conditioner or distant bark of a dog. But something about the stillness made him uneasy, like the calm before a storm. As he glanced up from his dashboard, his attention was caught by a sleek black luxury sedan gliding slowly down the street. The car was undeniably impressive, an expensive model that stood out among the modest sedans and SUVs typically seen in this part of town. For a moment Daniel admired it, but then his instincts kicked in. Something felt off. The driver, a black man in his late 40s dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, didn't fit the image Daniel had imagined for someone driving such a car. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. Was the vehicle stolen? Could it be connected to recent reports of car thefts in nearby neighborhoods? He shook his head slightly, reminding himself not to jump to conclusions. Still, protocol demanded he investigate further. With a deep breath, he turned on his patrol lights and pulled behind the sedan, signaling for it to stop. The driver complied immediately, pulling over smoothly to the side of the road. Daniel stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt and straightening his posture. His boots clicked against the pavement as he approached the sedan, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered firearm. A precautionary measure drilled into him during training. Through the tinted window, he could see the man inside sitting calmly, hands visible on the steering wheel. There was an air of dignity about him, almost regal, which only heightened Daniel's unease. "Good evening, sir," Daniel said, his voice firm but polite, as he leaned down to peer into the open driver's side window. "Do you know why I stopped you?" The man turned his head slightly, meeting Daniel's gaze with steady eyes. "No, officer, I don't," he replied, his tone measured and calm. "Is there a problem?" Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. The man's composure threw him off balance. He wasn't confrontational, nor did he seem nervous. Most people would have been fumbling for their license and registration by now, but this man simply waited, his expression unreadable. "I need to see your driver's license and registration, please," Daniel said, trying to maintain authority. As the man reached into his jacket pocket, Daniel tensed involuntarily, watching every move carefully. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. Was he being too cautious, or was he not cautious enough? When the man handed over a leather wallet containing what appeared to be legitimate documents, Daniel took them with gloved hands. The name on the license read Ezekiel Thompson. Everything looked in order, at least on paper, but the nagging feeling in Daniel's gut wouldn't subside. This wasn't just any routine traffic stop. There was something deeper at play here, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. As Daniel walked back to his patrol car to run the information, he couldn't shake the weight of the moment. The sky above was painted orange and pink, beautiful but fleeting. Inside the sedan, Ezekiel remained still, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the steering wheel. Neither man spoke, but both were acutely aware of the tension hanging thick in the air. What neither of them realized was that this encounter would ripple far beyond a simple roadside check. Lives were about to intersect in ways neither could predict, forcing each to confront questions they had long avoided, not just about trust, but about the unseen barriers that divided them. Officer Daniel Carter sat in his patrol car, the faint glow of his dashboard lights illuminating the interior as he typed Ezekiel Thompson's information into the system. The hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio filled the silence around him. Outside, the evening air grew cooler, but inside the car, Daniel felt a rising heat, not from the weather, but from the unease building within him. As he waited for the results to come through, Daniel glanced back at the sedan. Ezekiel was still sitting upright, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He hadn't moved an inch since handing over his documents. His calm demeanor unnerved. "Daniel," Most people would have shown some sign of agitation, tapping their fingers nervously, glancing at their watch or shifting uncomfortably in their seat. But not Ezekiel. It was as if he were deliberately trying to project control, even in this situation. The computer finally beeped, signaling that the records check was complete. Daniel scanned the screen carefully. Everything appeared legitimate. The license matched the registration, and there were no outstanding warrants under Ezekiel's name. The car was registered to him, paid for in full 2 years ago. On paper, it all checked out. But something still didn't sit right with Daniel. Why was a man like Ezekiel driving such an expensive car through this neighborhood? And why did he seem so composed? Daniel's training told him to trust the facts, but his instincts, the ones honed by years on the job, whispered caution. He couldn't ignore the voice telling him to dig deeper. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped out of his patrol car once again. This time, he approached the sedan with a clipboard in hand, pretending to review the paperwork. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his tone firmer now, "can you tell me where you're coming from tonight?" Ezekiel turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Daniel's. There was no trace of frustration or irritation in his expression, only patience. "I'm returning home after attending a legal conference downtown," he replied evenly. "Is there something specific you're concerned about, officer?" Daniel hesitated. The answer seemed plausible enough, but something about Ezekiel's polished tone set him on edge. It wasn't defensive or hostile. Instead, it carried an undertone of authority, almost as if Ezekiel were used to commanding respect. That realization made Daniel feel smaller somehow, less confident in his position. "I just need to verify your story," Daniel said, forcing himself to sound authoritative. "Do you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" For the first time since the stop, Ezekiel's composure faltered. His eyebrows rose slightly and a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with incredulity. "No, sir," Daniel replied quickly, though his own uncertainty betrayed him. "This is standard procedure when conducting a thorough investigation." Ezekiel studied Daniel for a long moment before nodding slowly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he stood beside the sedan, his height and presence became even more pronounced. Dressed in his tailored suit, he looked every bit the professional he claimed to be. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. "May I ask what exactly you're investigating?" Ezekiel asked, folding his arms across his chest. His tone remained polite, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet challenge masked beneath civility. Daniel swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt standing there. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the distant chirping of crickets underscored the tension between them. For a brief moment, Daniel considered letting Ezekiel go. After all, the records had cleared him, but his pride wouldn't allow it. "Not yet. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thompson," Daniel said, his words clipped. "You understand, don't you?" Ezekiel tilted his head slightly, studying the younger officer with an intensity that made Daniel uncomfortable. "Of course," Ezekiel replied softly. "We're all just trying to do our jobs, aren't we?" The comment hung in the air, heavy, with unspoken meaning. Both men stood there, locked in a silent standoff, each grappling with their own thoughts. To Daniel, this was about following protocol and ensuring safety. To Ezekiel, it felt like something else entirely, a reminder of the invisible barriers that often dictated how people saw one another. Neither of them realized yet how deeply this encounter would force them to confront those barriers, and themselves. The tension between Officer Daniel Carter and Ezekiel Thompson thickened with every passing second. The street, once quiet and serene under the soft glow of the evening lights, now felt charged with an unspoken weight. Ezekiel stood beside his sedan, his arms still folded across his chest while Daniel fidgeted slightly, gripping the clipboard tighter than necessary. "I need to conduct a quick search of your vehicle," Daniel announced, his voice louder this time, as if trying to assert authority over the situation. It's standard procedure when there are inconsistencies. Inconsistencies? Ezekiel repeated, his tone calm but sharp enough to slice through the night air. He unfolded his arms and took a small step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. What inconsistencies, officer? My license and registration are in order. I've answered your questions truthfully, and yet you continue to treat me as though I'm guilty of something. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, feeling the heat of Ezekiel's gaze on him. I'm not accusing you of anything, sir, he replied, though his words lacked conviction. I'm simply following protocol to ensure everything checks out. Ezekiel studied him for a moment longer, then sighed deeply. Very well, he said finally, stepping back toward the car. But let me make one thing clear. I'm cooperating because I have nothing to hide, not because I believe this is justified. Daniel nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact as he moved to the driver's side door. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, the leather interior releasing a faint scent of polish and luxury. For a brief moment he marveled at how pristine the car was. Every surface gleamed, untouched by dust or wear. It didn't look like a stolen vehicle. It looked like it belonged exactly where it was, with its owner behind the wheel. Still, Daniel pushed aside his doubts and began the search. He started with the glove compartment, finding only the usual items: a vehicle manual, a spare pair of sunglasses, and a stack of neatly organized receipts. Next, he checked the trunk, which contained nothing more suspicious than a gym bag and a folded blanket. Each discovery only deepened his unease. He had expected to find something, anything that might validate his suspicions. As Daniel rummaged through the car, Ezekiel leaned casually against the hood, watching him with an unreadable expression. Officer, he said after a while, his voice cutting through the silence. Do you often conduct searches like this during routine traffic stops? Daniel froze for a split second before resuming his task. Only when circumstances warrant it, he muttered without looking up. And what circumstance warranted this? Ezekiel pressed gently, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. Was it my driving? The condition of the vehicle? Or? He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Daniel straightened abruptly, slamming the trunk shut harder than intended. Look, Mr. Thompson, he snapped, finally meeting Ezekiel's gaze. I'm just doing my job. You can question my methods all you want, but at the end of the day, I'm here to protect people. If that means checking twice instead of once, so be it. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Daniel's outburst. Protecting people is admirable, officer, he said quietly. But tell me, are you protecting them from me, or are you protecting yourself from what you think I might represent? The question struck Daniel like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Instead, he turned away, pretending to examine the car's exterior for damage. The truth was, he didn't know why he was pushing so hard. Was it because of the recent string of car thefts in the area? Or was it something deeper, something he hadn't dared to acknowledge? Ezekiel seemed to sense Daniel's internal struggle. He uncrossed his arms and took a step closer, his voice softer now. We're both caught in a moment neither of us chose, he said. But maybe we can decide how it ends. Daniel glanced at him sharply, unsure of what to say. Before he could respond, the distant wail of another police siren broke the quiet, drawing both their attention. A second patrol car was approaching, its lights flashing against the darkening sky. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply stood there, two strangers bound together by circumstance, each grappling with emotions they couldn't fully articulate. And as the second officer stepped out of his vehicle, the dynamic shifted once again, forcing both Daniel and Ezekiel to face not just each other but the world around them. The arrival of the second patrol car brought an unexpected twist to the tense standoff between Officer Daniel Carter and Ezekiel Thompson. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the street, breaking the calm that had settled over the neighborhood. As the second officer stepped out of his vehicle, Daniel felt a mix of relief and unease wash over him. Relief because backup had arrived, but unease because he wasn't sure how this new presence would affect the situation, or whether it would complicate things further. Officer Maria Alvarez approached with measured steps, her posture relaxed yet alert. She was a seasoned officer known for her ability to diffuse even the most volatile situations. Her sharp eyes quickly took in the scene, Daniel standing near the sedan, looking increasingly flustered, and Ezekiel leaning casually against the car, exuding quiet confidence despite the circumstances. "What's going on here, Dan?" Maria asked, her voice calm but firm as she glanced between the two men. "Dispatch said there might be a potential issue?" Daniel hesitated, suddenly aware of how the situation might appear to someone else. He cleared his throat before responding. "I pulled Mr. Thompson over due to concerns about the vehicle possibly being stolen," he explained, gesturing toward the luxury sedan. "His documents checked out, but I decided to conduct a search as a precaution." Maria nodded slowly, turning her attention to Ezekiel. "Is that correct, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but probing. Ezekiel straightened slightly, meeting her gaze with the same composed expression he'd maintained throughout the encounter. "That's accurate," he replied evenly. "Your colleague has been thorough, perhaps overly so, but I've cooperated fully. My license, registration, and the contents of my car are all in order." Maria studied him for a moment, noting the way he carried himself. There was something commanding about his demeanor, a quiet authority that made her pause. Turning back, to Daniel she lowered her voice. "Did dispatch flag anything unusual about the vehicle or its owner?" Daniel shook his head reluctantly. "No, nothing came up in the records check, but," he trailed off, unsure how to articulate the nagging feeling that had driven him to push harder. "But you thought it was worth investigating further," Maria finished for him, her tone neutral. She turned back to Ezekiel, offering a small, professional smile. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. We're just trying to ensure everyone's safety. If everything checks out, and it appears to, I'll make sure we wrap this up quickly." Ezekiel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words. "Thank you, officer," he said. "I appreciate your professionalism. However, I must admit, I find it curious why my cooperation hasn't been enough to resolve this matter sooner." Maria glanced at Daniel, who avoided her gaze. She could sense the tension simmering beneath the surface and decided to address it directly. "Mr. Thompson," she began, choosing her words carefully, "can you tell me where you were earlier today? Any details that might help clarify things?" Ezekiel didn't hesitate. "I attended a legal conference downtown," he replied. "It concluded around 4 o'clock, after which I drove home. You're welcome to verify my attendance if needed." Maria nodded, impressed by his composure. "We'll look into that," she assured him. Then turning to Daniel, she added, "In the meantime, let's give Mr. Thompson the benefit of the doubt. Unless there's concrete evidence suggesting otherwise, we should consider wrapping this up." Daniel clenched his jaw, torn between following protocol and trusting his instincts. He knew Maria was right. There was no hard evidence to justify continuing the stop, but admitting that felt like conceding defeat. More than that, it forced him to confront the uncomfortable realization that his actions might have been influenced by biases he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. As Maria moved to return to her patrol car to run additional checks, Ezekiel spoke again. "Officer Alvarez," he said, his voice steady, "may I ask one thing? Do you believe people should be judged based on facts or assumptions?" Maria met his gaze, recognizing the weight behind his question. "Facts," she replied without hesitation. "Always facts." Ezekiel gave her a slight nod, then turned his attention back to Daniel. The younger officer looked away, unable to meet his eyes. For the first time since the stop began, Ezekiel allowed himself a faint, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truths hanging in the air. Meanwhile, Maria's radio crackled with updates from dispatch. Among them was a report, confirming Ezekiel's attendance at the conference. As she relayed the information to Daniel, the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, not just for the case, but for the emotions swirling within each person involved. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about trust, perception, and the fragile bridges that connected strangers in moments of uncertainty. The confirmation from dispatch that Ezekiel Thompson had indeed attended the legal conference downtown was the final piece of evidence needed to clear him. Officer Maria Alvarez relayed the information to Daniel with a pointed look, her expression a mixture of professionalism and quiet disapproval. For Daniel, the news felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had been so certain that something was amiss, but now he was forced to confront the truth. There was no wrongdoing here. Ezekiel stood silently as the two officers conferred, his arms crossed once again. His calm demeanor hadn't faltered throughout the ordeal, but there was a subtle shift in his posture now, a slight straightening of his spine as if he were preparing himself for what came next. When Maria turned to address him, her tone was apologetic yet firm. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "everything checks out. Your attendance at the conference has been verified, and there's no reason to detain you further. I apologize for the inconvenience this stop may have caused." Ezekiel nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Thank you, Officer Alvarez," he said, his voice steady. Then, glancing at Daniel, he added, "And thank you, Officer Carter, for ensuring the safety of your community. I trust we can all agree that justice depends on fairness, not assumptions." The comment hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks flushing despite his best efforts to remain composed. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply handed Ezekiel's license and registration back through the open window of the sedan. As Ezekiel slid back into the driver's seat, Maria stepped closer to Daniel, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You did your job, Dan," she said gently, "but remember why we do it. Trust is everything in this line of work. If people don't feel like they're being treated fairly, then we've already lost half the battle." Daniel nodded mutely, his mind racing. Maria's words struck a chord deep within him, forcing him to reflect on his actions and his motivations. Had he truly been acting out of concern for public safety? Or had his judgment been clouded by preconceived notions, shaped by biases he hadn't even realized he harbored? Before Daniel could fully process these thoughts, Ezekiel rolled down his window one last time. "Officers," he said, his tone polite but deliberate, "if I may offer a suggestion, perhaps training sessions on implicit bias would benefit your department. It's a small step, but an important one." Maria smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. "That's a good idea, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for sharing it." Ezekiel gave her a brief nod before turning his attention to Daniel. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw something flicker in Ezekiel's gaze. Not anger or resentment, but understanding. It was as if Ezekiel recognized the inner turmoil Daniel was grappling with and chose to extend, a measure of grace instead of judgment. With that, Ezekiel started the engine, the low hum of the luxury sedan filling the silence. As he pulled away from the curb, the red taillights disappeared into the distance, leaving Daniel and Maria standing alone under the dim glow of the streetlights. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool now, carrying, with it, the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Finally, Maria broke the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone softer than before. Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm not so sure." Maria placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Dan. What matters is how we learn from them. This doesn't define you. It's just a moment. How you handle it moving forward will show who you really are." Daniel nodded, slowly, though the weight of the evening still lingered. As they returned to their patrol cars, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had changed something fundamental within him. It wasn't just about Ezekiel or the traffic stop anymore. It was about the invisible barriers he'd never noticed until tonight, and the hard work it would take to dismantle them. Little did Daniel know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, trust, and humanity itself. The drive back to the station was quiet for Officer Daniel Carter. The hum of the patrol car's engine and the occasional crackle of the radio did little to fill the heavy silence that surrounded him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as his mind replayed every moment of the encounter with Ezekiel Thompson. It wasn't just the stop itself that haunted him. It was the way Ezekiel had looked at him, the calm authority in his voice, and the subtle yet pointed remarks about fairness and assumptions. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been exposed not by Ezekiel but by himself. For years he'd prided himself on being a good officer, someone who followed the rules, protected the community, and treated everyone equally. But tonight, those beliefs felt like cracks in a foundation he thought was unshakable. Was he truly impartial? Or were there biases lurking beneath the surface influencing decisions he didn't even realize he was making? When he arrived at the station, Maria was already there, filling out paperwork at her desk. She glanced up as Daniel entered, her expression softening when she saw the troubled look on his face. "You okay?" she asked again, though this time her tone carried more concern than before. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. He stared at the floor, his thoughts swirling. "I keep thinking about what Mr. Thompson said, about trust and fairness. I've always believed I was doing the right thing, but now, I'm not so sure." Maria leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "It's tough when you're forced to confront something uncomfortable," she said gently. "But it's also an opportunity to grow, to learn, to be better." Daniel looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "What if I can't? What if I make the same mistakes again?" "You won't," Maria replied firmly. "Not if you're willing to put in the work. None of us are perfect, Dan. We all have blind spots. The key is recognizing them and taking steps to address them." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pamphlet, sliding it across the desk toward him. "This is from a workshop I attended last year on implicit bias. It might help you understand some of the things we talked about tonight." Daniel picked up the pamphlet, flipping through its pages. The words seemed foreign yet familiar, like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known were missing. "Thanks," he murmured, tucking it into his pocket. "I'll read it." Maria nodded approvingly. "Good. And listen, if you ever want to talk about it or anything, I'm here. You're not alone in this." Her kindness softened the weight pressing on Daniel's chest, but it didn't erase it entirely. As he left the station later that night, the streets empty and silent under the glow of the streetlights, he found himself replaying Ezekiel's final words. Perhaps training sessions on implicit bias would benefit your department. At first, Daniel had bristled at the suggestion, interpreting it as criticism. Now, however, he saw it for what it truly was, an invitation. Ezekiel hadn't lashed out or demanded accountability. Instead, he had offered a path forward, a way to bridge the gap between misunderstanding and mutual respect. That realization stayed with Daniel as he drove home, the city skyline fading into the distance behind him. When he walked through the door of his apartment, he didn't turn on the TV or scroll through his phone like he usually did. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table, took out the pamphlet Maria had given him, and began to read. Each page challenged him to think differently, not just about policing but about people, about how easy it was to judge someone based on appearances, stereotypes, or assumptions, about how much harder it was to see beyond those surface-level impressions and recognize the humanity within. By the time he finished reading, dawn was breaking, outside his window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Daniel felt exhausted but strangely hopeful. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time in a long while, he felt motivated to try. As he got ready for another day on the job, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. He would start seeing people not as profiles or probabilities, but as individuals deserving of dignity and respect. It wouldn't undo the past, but it could shape the future, and maybe, just maybe, prevent moments like the one with Ezekiel from happening again. Little did Daniel know, his journey toward understanding was only beginning, and the lessons he would learn along the way would change not just him, but the lives of those around him. Weeks passed since the night Daniel Carter had stopped Ezekiel Thompson. Life in the small suburban neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Children playing on sidewalks, neighbors exchanging greetings over garden fences, and patrol cars quietly cruising through the streets. But for Daniel, nothing felt quite the same anymore. The encounter with Ezekiel lingered in his mind like an unfinished melody, haunting yet transformative. Determined to grow from the experience, Daniel threw himself into learning. He attended workshops on implicit bias, read books about systemic inequality, and even joined a local community group aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement and residents. At first, he hesitated to share his reasons for joining, fearing judgment or skepticism. But as he listened to others' stories of frustration, mistrust, and hope, he realized that vulnerability was the first step toward building bridges. One evening, after a particularly eye-opening discussion at the community group, Daniel decided to reach out to Ezekiel. It wasn't easy. The thought of contacting the man who had exposed his flaws made him uneasy. Yet something inside him urged him to try, to close the loop that had been left open that night. He found Ezekiel's contact information through public records and sent him a brief email. In it, he apologized for the traffic stop and expressed gratitude for Ezekiel's composure and insight. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what happened," Daniel wrote. "Your words stayed with me, and I want to thank you for challenging me to be better." To Daniel's surprise, Ezekiel responded within hours. His reply was concise but warm. "Officer Carter," it began, "your willingness to reflect and learn speaks volumes. If you're sincere about making a difference, I'd be happy to meet and discuss ways we can work together to improve our community." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a neutral space where they could talk without the weight of uniforms or titles. When Daniel arrived, Ezekiel was already seated, sipping a cup of tea. He looked just as composed as he had during their initial encounter, though there was a softness in his expression now, a hint of openness. "Thank you for meeting me," Daniel said as he sat down, his voice tinged with nervousness. Ezekiel nodded. "Thank you for reaching out," he replied. "Not everyone is willing to take this step." Their conversation flowed more easily than Daniel expected. They spoke candidly about the challenges facing both law enforcement and communities of color, the mistrust, the fear, the misunderstandings. Ezekiel shared personal anecdotes about encounters with police officers, some positive and some painful. Daniel listened intently, absorbing every word. "I don't have all the answers," Daniel admitted at one point, "but I'm committed to doing better, for myself, for my colleagues, and for the people I serve." Ezekiel smiled faintly. That's all anyone can ask for, to see the effort and believe in the possibility of change. By the end of their meeting, they had outlined several ideas: joint training sessions for officers and community members, regular forums to address concerns, and initiatives to increase transparency. Both men knew these steps wouldn't solve everything overnight, but they represented a beginning, a chance to rewrite the narrative. As they parted ways, Ezekiel extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly, feeling a sense of connection he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he understood that trust wasn't something given freely. It had to be earned, brick by brick. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became a vocal advocate for reform within his department. Ezekiel, meanwhile, continued to champion justice in his courtroom and beyond. Though their paths rarely crossed again, the impact of their meeting rippled outward, touching lives far beyond either of them. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but Daniel and Ezekiel had taken the first step together, one that bridged divides and proved that understanding could bloom even in the most unlikely places. And sometimes, that was enough to spark real change.